Indian Ocean. We always used to say no foreign powers in the Indian Ocean. That was our basic principle. Of course, there are many powers there in the Indian Ocean, but we didn't accept any of them. But we started joint exercises with the US in the Indian Ocean. Can you believe it? Non-aligned India. So the idea was to get as close to the United States as possible. And the problem was everybody in the world was wanting to do the same thing. Because Soviet Union had collapsed, they had a mad president called Yeltsin who wanted to join the United States himself as the 51st Republic. He was so mad that he said, how can I survive, so I better join the US. So Soviet Union was in shambles. They got divided into 15 states and they became a non-existing force in the world, as it were, at that time. And India had to be dependent on the United States, and we changed our economic policy. We opened our markets. We told the Americans, you can import, export, whatever you want. Foreign investment was encouraged, and consequently our economic development went up to 11% during that period. That is, say, from 1990 to 95 or so. Till then our economic development was 3% rate of growth. So people used to joke about India's Hindu rate of growth, they used to say. 3% growth is nothing. So they used to ridicule us by saying the Hindu rate of growth. And from there, because of the policies advanced by Narasimha Rao, and of course Dr. Manmohan Singh was his finance minister, they changed the whole picture of India. What you see India today is the creation of Narasimha Rao. But he is very underestimated, because he's a quiet man, he doesn't talk much, and so on. So nobody understood the greatness of the man, except some of us who worked with him, because he took very, very brave decisions, which we thought he will never do. Anyway, so that went on. So he also did not test the nuclear weapons, because he knew that the Americans would be upset. So he refused to do that. He was very close to Vajpayee, and therefore he had support from the opposition also. But in any case, that changed our foreign policy entirely. And that is what we call globalized foreign policy of India. It started in 1990, the collapse of the Soviet Union. And then we opened our economy, we developed relations with all the industrialized nations of the world, Japan, Korea, Germany, France, all of them. And they felt more confident about us because our economic policies changed. Then they know what they have to gain. Even the Americans, they were attracted by the large market that India has, because we never allowed anything to be imported into India. And now the large market of about 300 million people, of course we have 1 billion people, but they were interested only in 300 million people who are called the middle class. That means people who use toothpaste or television or motor cars. They were not interested in the other 700 million. But they were interested in the 300 million people in the consumer society in India. And that opened up their economy. United States prospered. United States used to say, if every Indian uses one toothbrush from the United States, American economy will flourish. And that's what they did. And they dumped everything on us, and CNN came, and we started seeing the nice things in the world. So we all wanted it. Everybody wanted, sprays, and the whole approach of the world changed, and everybody was fighting to come into India. And that is how we had this 11% growth. And then of course we had the Vajpayee government, short while, and then little later. Once he was there only for 13 days or something, and then elections took place, and in between there was Mr. Gujral. Not much change. Mr. Gujral's foreign policy, there was only one point which will come in all examinations, is what is called Gujral Doctrine. What is Gujral Doctrine? This is, he theorized that our relation with our neighbors is very bad, because no neighbor trusts us, because Pakistan obviously, and under Pakistan influence and Chinese influence, others, they'd all turned against India. So he was thinking of a solution to this. How do we resolve, or how do we build our relationship with our neighbors? So when he was foreign minister, not when he was prime minister, under Dev Gowda he was foreign minister also. So at that time, he put forward this theory, which came to be known as Gujarat Doctrine. He didn't call it Gujarat Doctrine. This was called by others. He was my ambassador in Moscow, so I knew him very well. So he said that India must make unilateral concessions to our neighbors. This was the theory. Because in international relations, everything is reciprocal. That whatever you do in reply or in response to what the others are doing. So if we are supporting Nepal, giving them cement, giving them petrol, then we expect Nepal to be friendly to us and not have an affair with China. That's what they wanted to do. They want everything from us, but when important things come, they will support China. So Mrs. Gandhi used to say, once she closed off the border with Nepal, because the Nepalese were misbehaving. That was Mrs. Gandhi's policy. 3 days, Nepalese had no petrol, no salt, no sugar. And the international community was very agitated. But then, of course, she opened. But this was the example that Mr. Gujral said. Yeah, they are like our children. If they misbehave, okay, you punish them, but you don't refuse them anything. So the idea of Gujarat Doctrine is non-reciprocal concessions by India, whether this will work or not. And it did not work. For example, Sri Lanka wanted Indian forces to be withdrawn. We went there, we lost 1,000 people in when the agreement was between Prabhakaran and Jayawardene in Sri Lanka. So if we had stayed there, Sri Lanka would have become stable. But the Prime Minister at that time, Premadasa, asked our Prime Minister to withdraw the Indian forces, and he did, without even asking our generals or anybody else. He said, we want good friendship with. That is how Sri Lanka was ruined further. But anyway, Indian forces were withdrawn. This was one of the examples. But it did not work. We realized very soon that the more concessions you make, they ask for more concessions. And so Gujarat Doctrine was forgotten. And that was the only contribution that he made. And then the real BJP government came to power under Mr. Vajpayee. Vajpayee was very Nehruvian. Of course, today's BJP will not accept that. If I say he was a Nehruvian, they say, no, he had not known about Nehru. But he was a very confirmed Nehruvian, and that's why he was very friendly with Narasimha Rao too. And so his vision was that of Nehru, in the sense that India must give to the world rather than seek anything from there. Whatever is important for us, we should do regardless of what the world thinks. And so he had a very, very good approach. And so he joined, shall we say, this globalized foreign policy. He continued. But the dramatic thing he did was the nuclear weapons test in 1998. He knew very well that this would destroy our relationship with the United States. And that is why Narasimha Rao did not do. And from Rajiv Gandhi onwards, they were trying to test nuclear weapons, because we had tested once in 1974 under Mrs. Gandhi. And then nothing was done. And so it had become very antiquated, our nuclear knowledge. And the scientists were asking for this test repeatedly. And Narasimha Rao never agreed. And of course, Morarji would never have agreed. And finally, after 13 days of being the Prime Minister, on 13th of May 1998, he exploded 5 nuclear weapons and announced that India is today a nuclear weapon state, like the other 5. And that created a whole revolution in the world, because none of them wanted us to do that. So the international community turned against us. Almost all of them, everybody, Chinese, the Soviet Union, particularly the 5 permanent members. And they imposed sanctions against us. It was a very, very critical moment in Indo-US relations. And Clinton, though he was friendly towards India, he said, I had his own words, when he heard the news, he said, I'm going to come down on these guys with like a ton of bricks, he said. And that's what he did. Sanctions all over the place. Vajpayee sent a letter to Clinton, which I went and delivered because it was supposed to be top secret. And next day we saw the letter in the New York Times. That was the attitude of Clinton. Because there we had explained was that this test is not against Pakistan or United States. It is only against India, because we think China is our biggest enemy. So the best thing for them to do was to publish it in the New York Times the next day, because the Chinese became our worst enemy after that. So, and that is the kind of mood there was in Washington. And then we started discussions with them. We started in the test was in 1998. And about 6 months later, Mr. Jaswant Singh came to Washington. Till then, they were refusing to talk about it. And 2 years, we continued a dialogue with the United States. 2 years in different parts of the world. We all earned a lot of mileage because we are all traveling with Mr. Jaswant Singh. And for the first time, there was a very open discussion between India and the US on India's priorities, India's threat perception, what we need, what we do not need, the assurance we gave that we will not become a nuclear power, non-nuclear arms race. We are still willing to disarm if everybody else disarms. So all this took about 2 years. And then the Americans are finally reassured that India was not up to any major mischief. And so relations came back to normal, with President Clinton visiting in 2000 March to India. The president who had come after 39 years. Of course, Carter had come for a short while, but that's not considered a visit. And Clinton, of course, was always in love with India. He wanted an excuse for him to come. And we agreed on everything except the nuclear issue. And a new relationship was formed. And of course, on nuclear issue, we said we cannot solve it as long as India does not sign the NPT. And so everything else was agreed, and then Vajpayee came to Washington in December 2000. And that normalized our relationship with the United States completely, and we agreed on many things, particularly economic development. And that changed India's foreign policy completely. The idea was to be, of course, we still talked about strategic autonomy. We talked about multi-alignments. So all this came into being during Mr. Vajpayee's time. That is, our relationship became very stable. It still belonged to that globalized foreign policy thing. It went on till 2014, till Mr. Modi came. So the whole period from Mrs. Gandhi's time, when it was a pragmatic policy, and then we had a globalized foreign policy under Narasimha Rao, and it continued with Vajpayee and others till 2014. Well, by that 2014, then with some differences developed between India and the United States. But it was a stable relationship, but still we did a few things which Mr. Obama did not like. Like, for example, we did not buy the fighter aircraft from the United States. They offered us F-16 and F-18. And for a long time they thought we will buy that. But for one reason we did not buy F-16 and F-18. That was $10 billion. And we went and bought Rafale from the French. You know that problem is still going on. But the Rafale contract was signed by Mr. Manmohan Singh, and not by Modi. But that Rafale contract created the problem for the US. And secondly, our nuclear collaboration. You know, the nuclear deal which was signed between President Bush and Manmohan Singh had agreed that we will buy $10 billion worth of nuclear material from the US. That was part of the agreement. But we did not buy, we could not buy, because we in between made a legislation. It is called Nuclear Liability Act, which was passed in the Indian Parliament. And that went against international law. According to international law, if somebody sells you a reactor, let us say, and the reactor, there is an accident, then who will pay the compensation was the issue. Internationally, it is the operator which has to pay, not the supplier. Right? Suppose you buy a car and you go and crash on a tree and kill yourself. Who will pay the compensation? The Toyota company is not supposed to pay, isn't it? Because they have sold you already, and warranty is over or whatever. Unless there was a defect in the car, there will be no compensation from the supplier. But we changed that rule ourselves and said that if anything happens out of all these generators, these reactors, the supplier must pay the whole compensation. We made a law like that. And that was not acceptable to the US, and therefore we have not bought even a single piece of nuclear material from the US till today. So these two factors made Obama very angry. And therefore, after his visit to India in 2010, India-US relations again plunged. He was not willing to do anything. Of course, ongoing things went on, there was no problem, but he was not willing to do anything for India. And that culminated in that notorious incident where an Indian diplomat was arrested and strip searched in New York. You must have heard about that. Cobra Gade, that's the name of she was in the UN consulate in New York. And deliberately, just to show their anger towards India, this lady was arrested, being accused of misbehaving with her servant, of all things. That she was not paying the servant. It was deliberately done by the Americans to show their ultimate anger. And you don't do it to diplomats normally. But they did that. That was the rock bottom in India-US relations at that time. And Mr. Modi was one of those at that time said that this kind of country we cannot have a good relationship. And they were also angry with Modi when he was Chief Minister of Gujarat because he's supposed to have butchered lots of Muslims. Which Americans so banned him from entry into the US. He wanted to go to meet his Gujarati friends in the US and he was denied a visa even after he was Chief Minister. So there suddenly is Mr. Modi as Prime Minister. So the American ambassador went and gave him a visa at his residence. Please come to the US. That he knew. But great thing about Mr. Modi was he did not remember that at all. He never raised this issue of a visa after he became Prime Minister because his priority was the United States. He was convinced in his mind that the only way India can do well is by close association with the United States. So everybody asked him what happened to the visa issue. He said, what happened? Doesn't matter. Now, my priority. So he changed the foreign policy again.